Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside Dave Corbin. Glad to have you with us to explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020.
So spring break in Florida, Dave.
Yeah, I miss college students so much that we decided to vacation with a family. But it wasn't quite as planned. We thought Miramar Beach was tamer, not quite, Panama City Beach, that wild scene. But it still has its kind of crazier aspects, hence our later taping today on Wednesday the 16th. We're supposed to tape at 9:15 and it's 12:15. So
we got that moving because at 4 a.m, I got a text from you. And I thought, that can't be good. I was thinking you were still in Texas, so that would have been 3, but 3 or 4, not the hours of the night we're expecting to be exchanging texts.
Well, my rap repertoire, that just grew in leaps and bounds from about 10 p.m. to 3:30 a.m. last night. I think I know most of the hit rap music from 2022, and that's life in the fast lane with the spring breakers from Southern Miss and all the rest. Beaches here are great, though. I've never been to the Destin area, where Miramar is right next to Destin, and beautiful. I mean, white sand beaches. The water is gorgeous. Tomorrow we'll take out a boat on the Gulf. So yeah, just really, it's kind of neat that way. But we probably should have come maybe late April. Would have been a little
different week. Right? Different
theme,
Yeah.
No one is, I can assure you one thing, no one here is reading Aristotle's Politics in the whole Destin, Florida panhandle, I think, than myself, I believe, or talking about it. So it's good. Well,
that sounds about right. Yeah. Well, today we're starting book 6. We've got the first few chapters of the book to talk about. So why don't you get us started, Dave?
So here in book 6, he's going to, I think, circle back again to cover this question of how you can get democracy to be at its best and how you can get oligarchy to be at its best. This has been a continual theme throughout his assessment of these two major regimes. They're the regimes that show up the most. So why not try to understand them from every angle that you can? So in book 1, he kind of introduces how these regimes are organized. And he suggests that there can be various combinations that make one type of democracy different than another, or one type of oligarchy different from another. Some of the different ways that you can mix these regimes rest upon how people within the regime deliberate. So what type of deliberative function is there within the regime? How do the law courts look? How are things judged? And then thirdly, what's the mode of election within the regime? So you can have a very aristocratic deliberative element that is mixed with a more oligarchic legal system, or more oligarchic elective system. And likewise for democracy, you can have a very kind of constitutional means of deliberating, yet a very popular democratic means of operating both your courts and the elections. So this is kind of interesting for us because way back when we were covering the Federalist Papers, you see in many of the most famous Federalist Papers, this question of what type of federal constitution, federal republic is being put into place by the framers of the American Constitution. And they'll talk about that some of its deliberative elements are this way, some of its elective elements are this way. There's a mixing and matching of different types to try to get that most perfect set of balances between things. So here, that's the introduction to the subject. And then I think the second part that is worthy of taking out of this first chapter of book 6 is something you'd mentioned previously, and that is that what people are doing within a given regime, what their occupations are, where they lay their eyes each day, also goes very much into defining how a regime works. So to take a step back and summarize what I just said, institutions matter, how they're organized, how elections come into being, how things are adjudicated, how things are deliberated upon. But it's the what makes up the people and what they do, that mixing with those institutional devices gives us regimes as they are.
Yeah, I just think about maybe some examples that might help to illustrate some of this. So one of the advantages of studying early constitutions, even colonial constitutions, as part of the American story, is that you begin to see maybe what Aristotle has in mind in some of these elements. So what's it mean to have a more aristocratic deliberative element? Well, maybe that's an easy one. We think about a property requirement in order to hold office, or a property requirement in order to elect people to hold office. That naturally excludes some, maybe many or most, depending on the circumstances and how high those property requirements are. But think about the courts. This is an interesting one that pops up in a few of the early colonial constitutions. Of course, today we think about the standard court practice. You have a civil trial or criminal trial coming up, you hire a lawyer and they're the expert. They help you prepare your case and off you go. But it was actually illegal to hire lawyers in early colonial governments. And why was that? Well, it was an aristocratic element, right? You could plead your own case, and you could have somebody in some cases plead for you, but you couldn't pay them. If you were paying them, that was inappropriate, right? That was not gentlemanly. And so it obviously gives an advantage to those that are well connected, who are well educated in those areas. Or on the other side, in Pennsylvania, early Pennsylvania, I've mentioned this before, there was a rule that required that all legal documents be short and in English. And so you see the democratic quality there, right? Not overwhelmed with long paragraphs you can't make any sense of. And of course, in English rather than Latin, so that the average person can read and absorb them. So you think about those kinds of laws, which we wouldn't expect to show up anywhere in a constitution today, but helping to describe the character of the regime that emerges from laws like that. Yeah, I think Aristotle's pointing out here that these kinds of decisions and structures have an impact on who actually rules day by day and the overall character of the regime.
And then you mix into that the factor of the differences within the population of occupations practiced.
Right.
My guess is, right, 17th, 18th century, right up until the end of the 18th century, most individuals are farming. So farming has a distinctive quality. It requires a lot of you as an individual. It requires work from the beginning of the day until the end of the day. Oftentimes it would mean that you're working on your own land, and that's what you're worried about along with the weather. So you may have some skills with regard to getting equipment to be able to farm and being able to fix it. But at that time, you're not looking at an economy that is service oriented or that is urbanized or urbanized to a great degree. There may be urban centers, but the great majority of individuals living in the country at that time live an agrarian lifestyle, and that probably plays into those institutions as well, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And so as the economy diversifies, then different interests emerge. And of course, that's a good thing, according to Madison, to have that variety of interests that helps to reduce the influence of faction overall on the government. But yeah, I mean, a nation of farmers will have a different outlook on political life from a nation that has a industrial foundation to its economy or a service orientation like we have in our own day. So yeah, I think these are all factors that Aristotle brings to our attention, that we're so used to the circumstance in which we live as sort of being normal, that it helps to have these historical reflections that cause us to say, oh, wait a second, that's not necessarily normal. And there are other ways that the scope of economic activity influence our politics besides just the question of, what regulations we will or will not approve, or this healthcare plan or that healthcare plan, or those kinds of things. But there are other more fundamental ways that the character of a people shapes the character of its government.
Yeah, and here on a much smaller scale, we can see in Aristotle's writings that he had seen his own type of modernization occur in the previous century to 2 centuries in the Greek world within the city-state, that there was a time where most people lived in an agrarian setting, but cities like Athens and Sparta, as they come into being, they draw within them a population that is now more likely to be involved in trade and commerce and exchange. And with that comes a change in how people live, how they see flourishing. Certainly, if you look at the golden age of Athens, for example, all of these things like Greek tragedy and architecture and all the rest are really born out of that movement toward the city that occurred 2,500 years ago. So he can see that similar transition that we might have seen taking a look at the differences between 18th century America and present day America. Well, in chapters 2 and 3 of book 6 of the Politics, he then goes on to talk about a different influence that'll be very important in defining how a democracy operates. So here, leading off part 2 of book 6, he writes, "The basis of a democratic state is liberty, which, according to the common opinion of men, can only be enjoyed in such a state. This they affirm to be the great end of democracy. One principle of liberty is for all to rule and to be ruled in turn, and indeed democratic justice is the application of numerical, not proportionate equality, whence it follows that the majority must be supreme, and that whatever the majority approve must be the end and the just." So the essence of the democratic state is liberty. When that essence is applied to justice and the question of equality, Aristotle tells us that it leads the Democrat to think more in terms of numerical than proportionate equality. And we've covered this before, right? One person, one vote. The majority of the votes means that the thing is moving in the right direction. So there's not this principle of whether one individual's voice is a merited opinion or justified opinion. It's just that one individual has voiced it. The second element, along these same lines of defining what is best in terms of liberty, is the notion that a man should live as he likes. So numerical equality, one person, one vote, and that any individual ought to live as that individual deems good, just, etc. So you can see here how this opinion gives a lot of push to a democratic sentiment. It gives a lot of justification to a democratic sentiment. But of course, right, there's in the background this issue, well, if you let the majority rule, what happens if the majority rules in an unjust way? Or if you let a man live as he likes, what if he chooses to live in a way, right, that leads to his dissolution rather than his flourishing?
I mean, I think this is a great summary of the natural tendency of democracy, as well as the danger inherent in democracy. And, this, of course, brings to mind some of the things we talked about last season with democracy in America and the danger of allowing that majority to think of itself as having this godlike judgment over all things. I mean, the restraint that works in both of these areas is to reflect on the fact that this equality is a God-ordained equality. This equality is reflective of the fact that we are made equally in the image of God. Now, if that's the case, then the one who makes you has some things to say about how you ought to live, and of course has designed you in a loving way with certain principles that would guide you toward flourishing. So it's not that the instructions are those of a harsh taskmaster, but rather a loving God who wants to create the conditions for human flourishing. And so if we hold on to the notions of democracy, this public liberty that allows for participation in government, and private liberty that allows us to direct the course of our lives, but we do so within the boundaries of a God-ordained order and recognize our need individually and collectively to submit to that, then we can have all kinds of great things that emerge in that context. If we abandon that, if we think of ourselves as autonomous, and that equality is somehow something that we've somehow created for ourselves, then of course these worse outcomes result, and we see all the ways that majorities can abuse minorities, and we see ways that individuals can act that are destructive of their own lives and the lives of those around them.
And I think if you go back to this previous discussion that we just had about occupations and lifestyles, without a Judeo-Christian heritage, the Greeks didn't have that heritage, perhaps the best constraint against the use and abuse of liberty, both public liberty and individual liberty, was the very agrarian lifestyle that prevented you from taking advantage of public liberty to an extreme. If you're farming 12 hours a day, you don't have time to read Twitter. You're focused on the thing at hand, which is earning your daily bread, working for your daily bread. I think likewise, if you're working to survive, you may want to live as you like, but survival may be the very definition of living as one likes. Whereas if you're given that much more freedom, that much more ability to think through, okay, well, I want to do this, do I want to do that? You may find yourself, spinning your wheels in your head rather than working for your daily bread. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to have downtime, to be able to have the ability to think about what is the best life, et cetera. But there are some problems that come along with that liberty relative to liberty.
Yeah, you think about the kinds of instructions that Benjamin Franklin gave to his countrymen as Poor Richard in Poor Richard's Almanac. And the two cardinal virtues of that work were industry and frugality. And these are all over the place. And frankly, they're all over the place in the founding documents. And even in some of the founding constitutions of the states, you see the virtues along with the classical cardinal virtues. And you see this emphasis on working hard and then being thrifty. And, so a world of middle-class farmers and merchants and tradesmen, that kind of world that we had in 18th century America, it was a world where you needed to be industrious and frugal if you're going to make it. And you're right, there's a certain kind of discipline that carries with it that puts some restraints, some natural restraints on behavior in the public square, as well as your own individual life and community with others.
Yeah, and here you just look at the change in American life from the 17th and 18th to the 21st century, that we've gone from being a productive democratic society to being more of a consumptive democratic society. And the shift that occurs within our souls when that which directs us each day is not the productive element, but what can I consume? How much can I consume? What type of perhaps conspicuous consumption can I have with my free time, free money, et cetera? So this fits in well with the last chapter that we'll cover for today, chapter 3 of book 6. Aristotle asked the question at the beginning of chapter 3, how is equality to be obtained? And he talks here about the fact that there are more that are poor than there are wealthy. So how do you create a regime in which you allow the more who are poor, the majority, to rule without undermining that element of justice that occurs within proportionate justice? There's going to be some level of inequality or injustice, he argues, in anything that you bring into being, but the goal ought to be equality for equals and inequality for unequals. And that's really the challenge when you're trying to bring in the right type of democratic equality. Can you think of an example of this that would shed light on this problem back then and then today, Matt?
Yeah, well, I think about, for the first 100 or so years under the Constitution, the answer to the question that they would have given the founders and their successors for a few generations was twofold. Number one, you create a legal regime that doesn't privilege the wealthy. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson boasts that one of the first laws they passed in independent Virginia was one that ended entail and primogeniture. In other words, a law that divided fortunes equally at time of inheritance, right? The British rule is you entail a fortune, and so it's settled upon a certain firstborn male, regardless of the circumstances. So you think about what happens in Pride and Prejudice, right, where there's no Bennet son, and so the daughters are stuck in a bad situation because the estate is entailed away from them, and so Mr. Collins is going to inherit the wealth, and sets up the whole course of the story there. But you end that in America. And likewise, you end primogeniture. So there's no special advantage given to that firstborn son when you divide up a normal inheritance. And so it's divided evenly. What happens? Well, a large fortune becomes a small fortune pretty quickly if you've got 3 or 4 sons and you divide it equally. And so you're constantly in the process of creating and then dividing up these large fortunes. There's no permanent classes of rich and poor. And the second element of it was offering opportunity. And of course, the way that worked for that first century was primarily go west, young man, right? There was always more land. And so while the frontier was open, if you're somebody who's struggling back east, you move 100 miles west. And maybe if you struggle there, you move 100 miles further west. And of course, there's all the challenges that go along with that, the conflict with Native Americans and all the challenging organizing new states and all the rest. But that was the basic mode for preserving that economic equality. It's only when the industrial economy begins to take hold, late 19th century, that the question arises, can this be sustained some other way? Because it's no longer enough to divide fortunes and provide more land for opportunity. The nation's filling up. The economy is changing. How do we move this forward into the 20th and 21st century? And that's a question, I think, for today. We see over the last 20 years, one of the problems that we're struggling with in our politics is the economic stratification that's resulted from, the importance of high education, connections, right? The emergence of this information economy has not had egalitarian consequences. And so I think we're still trying to figure out, is there a formula for recreating that opportunity society that you had, at least for the white male population throughout the 19th century?
And it's interesting that when you look at some of the educationalists in the middle of the 20th century, they were considering what they called the paideia problem, which is what type of education would produce a type of character within America's political community that would allow for flourishing as we became more democratic. And the key to many of those thinkers who were part of the thinking through that paideia project was that education would be the means by which that moral character would be produced, and that sharing in all things, that equitable sharing in all things would be enabled. And of course, we don't see that happening in 2022. The amount of people who are going to high school and graduating from high school, the amount of diplomas is higher than it ever was. The amount of people who are going to college is higher than it ever was. But the disparity between those who have been able to do well in this economy and those who have not is growing. And I think that we want to think through what a solution to that is, but it'll be very important that we think through it, as Aristotle has in the beginning of Book 6, by noting institutional factors, but also by saying that character matters and what we're doing in our lives and how we do it matters as well. So a good transition for next week, in which he's going to continue to discuss what's the best type of democracy that can be produced, what are those people doing within that democracy, and hopefully we can see some things in his commentary next week and moving forward in Book 6 that will be well applied to our lives in the 21st century.
Sounds great. All right, we're going to wrap up the show by returning to Tocqueville's crystal ball. So the NCAA tournament, 64-team element at least, starts tomorrow. And so we're going to make our picks for the Final Four. And since this is Mike Krzyzewski's last year, unless he pulls a Brady on us, then we're going to also make our predictions for where Duke ends up. What is the last game, last round that Mike Krzyzewski coaches, assuming it's not a Final Four or a final appearance in the cards for him this year. All right, so we're going to start with the West region, where we have the number 1 overall seed, Gonzaga. You're going to take Gonzaga, Dave, or go somewhere other direction?
I am. I think this is probably the easiest of all the picks. I think that they're on a roll. They're playing out west. I think that they'll get by. They'll probably have a hard game in one of these four games, but I think that they're in a good position right now to make it to the Final Four.
Okay. All right. I agree with you on that one. So we'll see how far we have them going. But so far, we got at least Gonzaga into the Final Four for a second year in a row. Out east, we have defending champion Baylor as the number 1 seed, but also some other key contenders there. Who do you have in the East?
I think that Kentucky is the team that makes it to the Final Four. They are very popular right now. In fact, I think a lot of people are picking them as the backup to Gonzaga to win it all. Baylor, of course, a great year. I think that part of the problem with Baylor this year is they don't have the backcourt play that I think will be essential to a long tournament run. So I don't see Baylor advancing to the Final Four this year. I think Kentucky will be there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm staying chalk so far. I'm going to take Baylor as well as the number 1 seed. I agree with you. You know, there's nothing that seems to predict success in the NCAA tournament more than senior guards, especially senior point guards. So you have to choose other teams carefully if they don't have that in their profile. But I think that success last year they can build upon and at least get back to the Final Four for Baylor this time around. All right. In the South, again, a number of contenders there. This is probably one of the regions where there's been the most variety in the picks moving forward. Who do you have coming out of the South, Dave?
Yeah, I think definitely this is the strongest of the four regions. I think it's exciting for us because I don't know what the tickets will cost, but that Southern Regional we played in San Antonio a week from this weekend. So the last weekend in March, and you could have Villanova there, you could have Arizona, Tennessee, and I think that Tennessee will pull off a surprise here in that regional. I hope all three of those teams make it down here. I think that'd be an amazing grouping to get to the Final Four. But I'll take Tennessee.
Yeah, that'd be a fun ticket. You're right. I'm going to take Villanova, another team that in recent years shows it knows how to get through the brackets, and so I think I'm going to project them as a number 2 seed to get back to the Final Four out of the South. All right, last region is the Midwest. Again, seems like a number of contenders there. Dave, who do you like?
I'm going to continue on with this SEC theme and pick Auburn. So that gives me 3 of 4 in the Final Four from the SEC. It's not the influence upon where I'm living now, upon my pick. I just think that it's pretty well stacked this year, which is incredible given its success in football as well.
Yeah, so that's
Auburn, true. The 2 seed.
Okay, very good. I'm going to take Wisconsin because I think it's Big Ten has also been very strong this season. Has a lot of teams that seem like they're reasonable contenders. No real, got to be there kind of team. But I think there's going to have to be one Big Ten that makes it through to the Final Four. So I'm going to take Wisconsin as the 3 seed coming out of the Midwest.
This works out well. I mean, we'll be in great shape if we get to the final 8, because I think my Auburn team would be playing here, Wisconsin perhaps, Tennessee would be playing Villanova, and then, of course, Kentucky and Baylor perhaps in the East. I think the only thing we agreed upon is Gonzaga, which makes it fun. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, we'll have a lot of interesting matchups as we go through this. Okay, so now before we pick our ultimate champion and our finalists, let's talk about Duke. Dave, is this a Cinderella story? Obviously not going to the Final Four, either of our picks. How far does Krzyzewski get in his last season at the helm?
I think they get to the Sweet 16. I think there they lose to Texas Tech. So a Sweet 16 loss to Texas Tech.
I've got them going out in the second round to Michigan State, which I think could be a classic matchup. Maybe the next great coach to retire. But I just think there's too much pressure on this Duke team. I think they've shown that in that late season loss to North Carolina, the last one at home, the loss in the finals to Virginia Tech, very disappointing. They've kind of missed out opportunities to put the cherry on top for Krzyzewski, and I just have a feeling that's going to be the case in the tournament as well. He's going to try to take the pressure off them and do whatever he can, but I just don't think there's any avoiding the fact that they want to win for him. I don't think it's going to happen. So I think a second round disappointing loss to end a great, of course, college basketball career. All right. So now that leaves us with the last 2 picks. So we've got our finalists and then our ultimate champion. Who you've got?
I have Kentucky upsetting Gonzaga in the Final Four.
Wow.
Tennessee, perhaps upsetting. I think they'd be on a roll by that time over Auburn. and a final of Kentucky and Tennessee. And I looked back to when they had played this year, and in Rupp Arena, Kentucky had scored over 100 points on Tennessee, which is amazing given how good Tennessee plays defense. But then when they played in Knoxville, Tennessee won and held Kentucky to 63 points. So I just did the math. I averaged the two goals from the two games, and I come up with a Kentucky national championship over Tennessee, 85-78.
Okay. Well, sounds like a fun game. I've got Gonzaga over Baylor, so making the final for a second year in a row. Villanova over Wisconsin, and then Villanova winning to disappoint Gonzaga once again in the finals, 81-74. So a very similar score to yours, two different teams, obviously. But both of us, Gonzaga not quite getting it done once again.
Oh, I love that pick. I mean, I love Villanova. It makes me think back to, I think it was 4 years ago, my wife was almost offered the position of director of university events at Villanova. And she asked, well, how many days a week, are you on the road? And the lady who had the job said, well, during March, you're pretty much on the road. So you might have 2 or 3 nights where you sleep in your own bed in Philadelphia, but the rest you're going to be hopefully on the road. So she didn't choose to have that job, and hence we're in Miramar Beach, Florida. Rather than following Villanova around the country.
Yeah, I think I'd rather follow them on TV under the circumstances. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for this week's show. Thank you, as always, for listening. Please remember to subscribe and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can contact us at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. We'll talk to you again soon.
2020 vision.